I'm joined by Blair Pyle, and we're going to be talking about Burgal's Bounty. So thank you for taking some time out before launch to talk with us, Blair.
Of
Um,
course, for having me.
yeah. So first off, for people that haven't ever heard of Burgal's Bounty, why don't you pitch it to them? Tell us what it is, what the kind of story is, and why they should be excited.
All right, Burgle's Bounty is a logic-based puzzle game where you take on the role of Burgle, and he is trying to steal enough money to rescue his girlfriend Burgette from the mob. And the game features real-time puzzles as well as sort of logic-based plan your course puzzles and boss fights too. And there's a whole bunch of unlockable stuff and costumes and crazy crap you can find in the game.
Awesome. So I first saw Burgle's Bounty at Play NYC last summer, and the first thing that really grabbed me about this game was the art style, which has got this really kind of great, almost crayon on crumpled paper look to it. And since that's what grabbed my attention at first, I hope maybe you could talk about that first and where that art style came from, which is something I've asked developers before, but your story has a little bit more to it.
Right. Yeah. So the short answer is desperation. Um, so there was an earlier version of Burgle's Bounty that was released on Android back in 2015. It was only on Google Play for 2 months before my now ex realized the artwork was taken from various sources on the internet. So I did a Google reverse image search and found pretty much all of it. I think the only stuff that was original was the character and the little guy that she also created for the Phat Games logo. Everything else was just you could find it everywhere on the internet. And I confronted my artist or my former artist, obviously now about that, and she started by lying. And then I said, well, what about this and this? And I sent her links to everything. Uh, and then she got all upset because before she even responded, I pulled the game because I talked to a lawyer, also known as my brother. He said I should probably pull it. So I did. And I actually haven't spoken to her since.
Ah,
Um, so that night, or I think the next day or something, I was just going to this indie dev drink up thing. It was one that was sponsored by Amazon. There's so many of them going on in New York now. It's hard to keep track of them all. And I was just like sitting on the train and like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Do I just stop the project? Do I just take a step back and just start on something new, or do I redo it? I've learned a little bit from the data I've collected for the last 2 months while it was live, and redo the art. And who's going to do it? Am I going to do it, or am I going to find an artist, or how much is that going to cost me? Um, and then I was sort of thinking about some of my inspirations, things that I did when I was a kid. Like I used to doodle all the time when I was a kid, make these stupid little comic strips. And I also sort of thought of like a lot of the comics that I read, like Cyanide and Happiness, those little shorts
mhm.
you see on Facebook. They're usually pretty dirty and inappropriate, but fun nonetheless. And it's like, well, what if I did something simple like that? And then like this picture of like an old Mickey Mouse cartoon sort of popped in my head, like the Steamboat Mickey or that with old black and white and like really, all the lines on the film or whatever that's called. I don't know,
Mm, yeah, yeah.
but what if I did something like ridiculously simple like that? Maybe did some crumpled paper thing to make it sort of imply that it's meant to look like a 3-year-old drew it, because that was probably as good of art that I could actually pull off. Um, so I gradually on that train ride, I kind of got more and more inspired to try this out myself. So the next day, I started a few things. I like did a really crappy new logo, then like crumpled it up into like stop animation and like send it to a few people. It's like, how's this? And I drew a few like quick sketches of like the new Burgle, and then I decided, well, if I'm gonna redo this, I'm gonna give it a story. So he's gonna get a girlfriend now. So that's how Burgette was born. It was like this really crude drawing. It's like, why not? It works. The style I'm going for, and people seem to like it. And then it's like, all right, well, let's see where I can go from here. And the intention of the entire game was that it was supposed to look crude and not really polished, but I started polishing things as I went along because the crude thing wasn't working for me. And that's how it came to be, really.
Awesome. I think it's a really cool story of you kind of overcoming this huge hurdle that kind of just dropped into your lap, and you've got a series of blog posts out which we'll have a link to that kind of go a lot more in depth into this whole experience of creating Burgal's Bounty. Um, I wanted to touch on one kind of mechanical question of the game, which
Sure.
is the boss battles.
Right.
When I first tried the game, it's a very kind of fun puzzle game. But then suddenly I'm thrown into a boss battle, and I'm like, what? This is not something I've seen in here. So what was the inspiration to put in a boss battle like puzzle?
Well, I had thought about putting bosses in the game for a long time. Did you ever play Choo Choo Rocket for the Sega Dreamcast? And there was a
No.
Game Boy Advance. I don't know how much of a wide audience that game had, but it's better than most, I think. It was like it's very similar in terms of mechanic. It was multiplayer though, and you're trying to guide these mice. Haven't played in years, like into this basically trap or house or something. I can't really remember. And it's like, well, and it was all in real time. It's like, well, you could do something like that, except boss fights. And I knew it would be a ridiculous amount of work. So I never really sort of like wanted to do it. And then would finally sort of said, what the heck, I'll just do it. After I submitted the game the first publisher that turned me down. Um, and the publisher response is, I just couldn't really get into it. I'm like, what? Like, hearing that about your game you've been like working so hard on, I was actually pretty devastated. At that point, I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Like, how do I make this more appealing? So that's actually what introduced sort of the panic mode, that real time mode I mentioned earlier. And then with that, I'm like, well, if I've already let like scope loading this far out of control, I might as well just do the boss fights too. Big mistake. Oh my God, that was a huge mistake because it's like that added easily 5 or 6 months onto the development process. Just because as I said before we started the interview, I have a full-time job, so doing this evenings and weekends, things get done slowly. And with that, you're basically writing a whole mini game, and you have to do all the assets for it and come up with the mechanic that because it's each boss is a different mechanic that you need to use to beat them.
Yeah, I think that you've kind of highlighted a couple things that I'm hoping you can maybe pass some advice on to other aspiring devs in you're dealing with hurdles. I guess for lack of a better word, we'll call them hurdles. Be it doing this while maintaining a full-time job, having to deal with an artist giving you plagiarized work, having to essentially reinvent your game from the ground up. How did you deal with that? How did you tackle that and keep your motivation and move through to where Burgal's Bounty is now coming out on the 15th?
Yeah, I think any game developer is going to tell you that as the process goes on, they get closer and closer to the end. The motivation starts to drop almost exponentially in relation to how far along you are. And I guess in some ways these hurdles kept it interesting and kept the motivation up. I'm not easily. I don't get. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I downed a bottle of wine that night after the artwork was stolen. I was pissed. But at the same time, I'm kind of stubborn too. So it's like, oh no, I'm not going to give up on this. But in terms of advice on how to get past the hurdles, there's nothing that you can't really overcome. I mean, when you hit a hurdle, whatever it is, there'll be sort of an emotional response. You'll be shocked, you'll be angry, you'll be annoyed, because it's a kink in the plan. You know, it ruins your schedule. It could possibly derail the whole project. And with having a full-time job, it made it in some respects easier because I didn't get funding on Kickstarter. I don't have a publisher. I wasn't given money. A change in schedule wasn't going to necessarily make me have to eat like plain like white rice for like 6 months on
Right.
end. I could no longer afford to eat. So I had the benefit of that, and it certainly made it easier because the schedule really was on my time frame. I could do whatever I wanted, but I definitely wanted to get it done quickly. Um, but at the same time, one of the biggest hurdles is having a full time job because
Sure.
uh, you don't get a lot of time. And you want to get it done, and you work for a full day, and you move, and then I close one laptop and open the other, and I'm like, oh god, all I want to do is sleep.
uh,
And
yeah.
uh,
So now that we've, of course, talked about all the hurdles that you encountered, what started you on this crazy trip of game development? What got you inspired to start working on games?
um, I think it was a very close friend of mine from my childhood. He um, he started modify. Have you ever heard of a game called Nibbles? It was a game written in QBasic. It was like on an old 286 computer or something like way back. Probably dating myself. uh, so he actually started modifying the code for that game because it was just they gave you the source code and he changed a few things up and then he showed me how to do it and then from there we started making text-based games and we didn't the internet wasn't even around back then
Mm,
so everything we learned we had to use the help files and whatever documentation was there so we're all doing this in QBasic and he got me into it and we kept going with it probably until midway through college, and then we just didn't have time anymore. And then we took a very long break until 2010, and then by that time all the app stores were around, and he actually started up again because Burgal's Bounty was actually originally called Phat Professional Burglar, and it was a very different game we made in QBasic in 2001. So that's where the original concept came. He took that and made a Windows Phone version of it, and when he did that, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this again too. So, um, and that's sort of what got me back into it. But I've been doing it forever. I mean, I feel like I would have loved to have done this for my day job, but what happened, I think, when I was going to school, it was around the time it was when the Sony PlayStation and the N64 and if you ever played the Saturn first
mm.
came out, everything was 3D and 3D was really bad back then.
Yeah.
And I got turned off of gaming for a little while around that time, and I wasn't as interested in them. Then by the time like the PlayStation 2 was out and the Sega Dreamcast, I totally was back into it because things got to be really good. And but at that time, it's like I didn't really. I actually don't think I felt like I was smart enough to make games because I mean the tools weren't around back then that they are like now. There's no
Yeah.
Unity, there no Unreal. It was all you're writing custom game engines and doing a lot of intense math for a lot of 3D effects. And I was like, I'm not sure I can do that.
Well, you proved that wrong.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple games already that were kind of inspirations for Burgle's Bounty, but what were some of the games that looking back, you're like, that is what I want to build? Like your inspirations. You mentioned Nibbles as kind of the one that kind of got things rolling, but what were some of the other games that stood out to you as through your life?
Um, so what sort of where the concept came from? You know, I actually don't know if I can remember where the concept of the game came from or where it was inspired. I think I just wanted to make a puzzle game where you guided a dude around a maze. Um, and I was also sort of at the time myself and three like the Fat Games team at the time was heavily involved in the internet QBasic community,
Mm-hmm.
and we're this was the last game. Fat Professional Burglar was the last game we made in QBasic, and there was someone else who made a really awesome puzzle game there, and it was probably very poorly named Wet Spot.
Ugh.
I don't know why they called it that. You were
That's an interesting title.
It's like okay, whatever. But you're two crabs pushing blocks around a maze to like eat fruit and find an exit. It was not a dirty game at all or anything like that. It's like, and it was a lot of fun, and it's like, well, I want to make a really good puzzle game like this too. So I think that might have actually been part of the motivation. I know it comes from like the weirdest, like it wasn't a mainstream title that necessarily influenced this, but Choo Choo Rocket definitely played an influence, or had an influence as well, because that came out in '99, and we prototyped this back in the start of 2001 originally.
Cool.
So
And finally, to kind of to bring this to a close, we always ask people that are making games what other indie game titles or indie dev teams have really stuck out to you as something cool that you think people are making.
you've probably met a lot of them actually
It's
in
fine.
around the community. Treasure Adventure World by what does he call his company again? You know Steve Orlando? You may have met him at Play NYC.
Yeah,
Robot Games, is it? I think it's Robot Games. Um, have you met the guys from the Sheep's Meow?
I
They've
have met Sheep's Meow. Yeah,
exposure. That's looking kind of cool. Um, and Dean Razavi, Raspberry Games. He's working. I can't remember the title of it, but it's this new, basically card game that looks like it's gonna be pretty cool. And he already has Vidar out, which I actually started playing again recently, and it's like oh, this game is really good.
yeah. It's
Uh,
if Vidar catches you, it's a
yeah,
simple concept that works really really well. Cool, great. Well, there's some good suggestions there. Maybe we can jump off from those and talk to those people that we haven't talked to yet. Um, Burgal's Bounty will be coming out on iOS and on Android the 15th. We'll have links down below where you can find more information about where to get it and the aforementioned blog posts kind of detailing a little bit more about this whole process of creating Burgal's Bounty. Blair, thank you for taking the time to share this story with us and let us kind of share this with everybody else.
great. Thanks for having me.